let's start off with discussing very quickly and generally your latest book, Mr. Scruton, the uses of pessimism. What are the uses of pessimism? Why shouldn't we just be optimistic?
I think we should be optimistic about those things where optimism has some kind of foundation. But my theme in the book is that a certain kind of optimism, which Schopenhauer called unscrupulous optimism, has a grip on the human psyche, and it's something which constantly comes back. This desire to cling to hope when it simplifies the reality. And there goes with this desire fallacious ways of thinking which may once have been useful to our species, but which are useful no longer. And those fallacious ways of thinking, I believe, have penetrated the culture of the modern world, and they have a kind of dynamic of their own. They're constantly producing new policies, new conclusions, new perspectives on the human world. And the main uses of pessimism is to put an obstacle in the path of those fallacies, to say, stop thinking that there is a solution. Just remember that the best we can do is live with the problem.
Yes, you describe a type of person in your book, the unscrupulous optimist. Can you? What kind of person is that?
Well, there are many different kinds of these optimists, but fundamentally it's somebody who, when faced with the complexity of the human condition, decides he has to have a solution to it. Whereas the personality that I would recommend in the place of that is the one who, when faced with the complexity of the human condition, says, yes, the human condition is complex. And maybe
there's nothing we can do about it.
Or maybe I can make small adjustments at the edges, but I must learn to live with these monsters all around me and try and establish some kind of consensus with them.
Can you give a number of examples of these fallacious ways of thinking that the unscrupulous optimist applies, and some of the disastrous consequences in your view?
In the book I take a few examples. One, which I think is extremely important and has been important here in the Netherlands as well as in England, is what I call the born-free fallacy. The fallacy of thinking that, with Rousseau and people like that the human beings are naturally free. But what one must do is take away all the constraints that are imposed upon them by civilization. Constraints of custom, law, institutions, even things like the curriculum, those foundations of the social order which we tend to take for granted. I think that fallacy has been very important in revolutionary movements, very important also in the reforms of education that went on in Europe after the war.
Can you elaborate on that a bit?
Yes.
So the born-free fallacy and education, how do they...
The superstition arose during the 50s and 60s that children need to release their inner freedom and enjoy that natural curiosity which children have, and that the idea of a settled, structured curriculum in which you learn things by heart, in which you do maths for half an hour, English for half an hour, Latin for half an hour, and so on. All these things are oppressive, destroying the natural freedom of the child. Really, we want to be releasing that freedom. Therefore, the curriculum has to be opened up, made free, made non-judgmental. And I think that was a fashionable view which spread through educational practice all over the continent of Europe, and I think was very destructive of our intellectual inheritance.
Because people are not born free, in your opinion?
People become free, and it's a hell of an effort to become free. You become free through a long discipline of obedience. That's the fundamental thought.
Mr. van Rossem, you've worked almost all your life in education, or large part of your life so far. Do you recognize any of these analyses?
Yeah, I'm afraid I agree completely with that idea.
Is this the first time in your life that you agree completely with someone?
When it comes to education, I'm an extremely conservative person, and this whole idea that that students, in my case students of course, university students, should be left to their own creative devices is not a particularly good idea at all. And we had this small seminar groups where the idea was of course of a lively discussion about the wonderful ideas that the students have developed over the week, and the problem is they don't develop wonderful ideas over the week. And the whole idea that the classical teaching situation where a teacher is in front of a group of students, that is completely wrong and authoritarian and so forth and so on, I think is unjust and has created big problems in universities.
That's very.
So I think what we need in education is much more old-fashioned ideas. We shouldn't go back to the 50s. There must be some golden middle way. I'm always a consensus seeker. But
no longer focusing on the idea that
and discipline should come back into education, because without any discipline, education is nothing actually.
Another theme that you describe in your book, another fallacy that you talk about, is the idea that politics should always be aimed at some kind of utopian end. Can you elaborate on that a bit? Another theme that you describe in your book, another fallacy that you talk about, is the idea that politics should always be aimed at some kind of utopian end. Can you elaborate on that a bit?
Well, actually, I think there are two fallacies there. One is the fallacy that politics should be aimed at a utopian end. I think the whole idea of a utopian end is a fallacy.
Because no utopias exist.
Yeah, exactly. My life has been devoted to building Scrutopia, which is something completely different from utopia, involving accommodation to realities while enjoying them and rising above them. That's something we should all do, but that's something we do only by renouncing these utopias. But the other fallacy, the more important thing, is the idea that politics should be defined as a goal-directed activity in the way that, say, engineering is. You know, the engineer has to build a bridge across a particular canal. You know, there is his goal, and here are his materials. He does it by working out the appropriate means to an end. And that's a picture of human rationality, this means-ends rationality, which is very important to us. And much of education involves getting people to think in that way. But we make the mistake of transferring that kind of thinking into politics, thinking that the politician too has a goal, the new society, the egalitarian order, or whatever it might be. And he's got various instruments, that's people, and he organizes them in order to achieve that goal.
But that is probably true now of almost all politics in Western countries.
Politicians talk as though it were true, but of course it cannot be true, because it's an elementary truth about people that when you combine them, you cannot predict the result of what their individual decisions will be. That most things that happen by an invisible hand. That's something which I elaborate on in the book. And most things that last are the unintended outcomes of intentions that have long since gone.
Can you give one example? You talk about the European Union, for example. Is that an example?
Yes, it's a very good example of an unintended outcome of good intentions. The intentions were to unite the previously belligerent parties in Europe around a shared strategy for survival and for economic recovery, to give them each of them an interest in each other's success, so that they, rather than an envious desire to destroy that success. And that was the intention. All kinds of institutions were built up in order to further this intention. But nobody intended what we actually have. Nobody intended an acquis communautaire, which is 180,000 pages long. You know, and
so you believe that is a negative outcome?
Well, this is a negative one, yes. But there are positive outcomes of decisions which don't intend them to. For instance, the British Constitution, before the New Labour got its hands on it, that was the unintended outcome of millions of decisions over 1,000 years. But nobody knows what the British Constitution says, because it doesn't say anything. It's never been written down. Nobody knows what it authorises and what it doesn't. It is completely concealed within procedures, and for that very reason does no damage.
Mr. van Rossem, your latest book is on the dangers of populism. The title is "Why is the Citizen Angry?" How do you hear this analysis of politics as a goal-directed business and the idea of a utopia that can be reached? You write in your book about the dangers of populists presenting utopias to the people, for example.
Well, I think the central fallacy of politics is that it is there to make people happy. It should solve all kind of practical problems, and it shouldn't have the ambition to make people happy. People have to make themselves happy if they're able to do so. But that's not the task of politics, in my view. And it's certainly true that all political movements which promise us paradise in whatever form have had tragic results, really tragic results. And all the countries which have a long tradition of muddling through in a rather stupid way, falling into the future with their backs into the future, turn out to be quite happy and well-organized countries. I mean, of course in England there's no constitution at all. We have a constitution, but most Dutchmen have no idea what's in it. So there you have the same effect in a way. And I think the Netherlands is typically a country which has a long pragmatist consensus tradition, and in which the majority of the politicians have never thought that we should create paradise here. Maybe because to some extent in a comparative kind of scheme the Netherlands is a kind of paradise. Most Dutchmen don't realize the fact that in so far as it is possible to organize a human kind of society, I think some of the smaller Western European countries have been amazingly successful, and their inhabitants actually don't realize how successful they have been. And the great danger, of course, is that they are trying to make it even more successful with these terrible schemes in which everything is supposed to be turned out even better than it is.
And you identify populist movements in Europe in your book as utopian movements, and you finish this essay with the call for the people to recognize the imperfectibility of society.
Yeah, that's the final point. Not only the imperfectibility of society, but the imperfectibility of man, because the one is, of course, the product of the other. And well, this whole debate about populism is actually a kind of sub-problem, because I describe parliamentary democracy, which is the only well-working kind of democracy that we know of. But parliamentary democracy at the same time has all kind of practical problems and frictions and things that maybe don't work exactly as people want them to work. And that's where the populists come in. They say, well, this whole parliamentary democracy is all wrong, and the thing to have is more clarity and all kind of referenda and popular leaders by popular consent. And I think that's an enormous danger, actually. We should keep our in a way, an imperfect parliamentary democracy with all the specific problems that it has had over the last 2 centuries. And this dream of having a perfect way of managing our politics, which the populists sell to their voters, I think, is a very dangerous dream. Any dream which leads to great political changes is dangerous.
How do you view present-day populism in Europe?
Anyway,
shall we move on from Islam to religion generally? You write about religion being a a valuable break on the dangers of utopian thinking, because when we have an idea of a life hereafter, we are more easily reconciled with the fact that things are not perfect on this earth.
Well, I don't want to say anything quite as simple as that, because I think there are elements of utopianism in every religion, especially when the religion takes a millenarian form, as Christianity did every now and then in the Middle Ages.
And Al-Qaeda is doing now.
And Al-Qaeda does now, exactly. That you can easily turn the normal pious procedures and beliefs of a religious believer in a utopian direction. If you promise some kind of salvation that he can achieve here and now in conjunction with his fellows. What I would say is that it seems to me indubitable that there is a religious need in human beings. How it came about, whether it's a socially engendered thing or whether it is an evolutionary adaptation or whatever you want to say, it is there. And there must be good ways of managing it as well as bad ways of managing it. And I think that my own view is that the Christian way, especially as modified by the Enlightenment, is the right way to manage it. You manage it by removing religion from public life and giving it that, emphasizing the aspect of charity and forgiveness which lies at the heart of the Christian message. And that, I think, has done a lot of good in Europe. It is interesting that when the millenarian enthusiasms took hold of Europe again, it was in the French Revolution and in the 20th century revolutions of the fascist and communist revolutions, all of which were explicitly anti-religious and anti-Christian. It's when we lost the moderating influence of Christianity that we went mad again.
So there's also a danger in ruthless atheism, unscrupulous atheism.
Yes.
How do you view that, Mr. Rossem?
Well, I'm an atheist, so but atheists can be quite normal and friendly and polite citizens of any country, in my opinion. Having religion as such is no guarantee for being an attractive or nice person. I mean, there are terrible believers and there are very friendly unbelievers, and there are terrible unbelievers and very friendly believers. It just depends on the person and on the situation. And religion can be a force for good, and religion, as we all know, if you look at the history of Christianity, can be a terrible force. And to some extent, this whole idea of realizing a paradise on earth is rooted in Christian thinking, in the idea that history leads to a final point, to a final conclusion or situation. Look at these fundamentalist Christians in the United States, who have really strange ideas about the coming and end of history.
Right, so this also seems to be a point where the both of you take generally the same view.
Well,
Mr. Scruton?
I think over 1,000 pages of ruminations would probably differ. I think it's quite right to emphasize that Christian concepts are still influential in utopian movements in the West, insofar as those utopian movements still exist. But I think we should give credit to Christianity for many of the things that we've inherited, and in particular for the thing that I think both of us value, which is secular government. You know, and this was something which we see from the very beginning in the parable of the tribute money, when Christ said, "Give unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and unto God what is God's," meaning to emphasize that the jurisdiction here on earth is a man-made thing, and God's law is obeyed inwardly and with a view to the afterlife, not to life in this world.
Do such traditions also exist in Islam?
They don't, Islamic political thinking is unable to recognize the validity of secular law in my reading of it. It's always regarded as a temporary expedient, making the way for the final the Salafa, the final society of followers, in which the law that is obeyed is exactly that which was given by God to Muhammad.
Therefore, there seems to be a stronger problem of utopianism in Islamic tradition than in Christian tradition, in your view.
I would say that certainly that this was one of Christ's greatest gifts to humanity, that separation of the religious order from the secular order.
Would you like to respond one more time before we go on to architecture?
I have a few problems with Christianity, in the sense that I think when Christians are in the political majority, as they have been in the Netherlands up until 1967, that is the first time that they lost their parliamentary majority, they have a strong tendency not to have a clear divide between secular government on the one side and the things that the church or the believers want for themselves on the other side. And as when they are in a majority, they have a tendency to force the minority, which is maybe exists of non-believers or people with different religions, be it Jews or whatever, to force them to live according to their particular rules. Look at the typical Protestant Sunday, which was one of the most terrible day in my youth was Sunday.
Yeah, but the point was actually that the difference.
It was always there was
Mr.
always
Rossem, the point was actually the difference between Islam and Christianity. If you wanted to respond to that.
Yeah, that is to some extent that's true, but that has to do with the development of Islamic countries and the development of Islam in the 19th century. And Islam has also a long tradition of pragmatism, and they have their wonderful periods when they were rather tolerant. It largely depends on the particular situation and what the leaders of such a religious movement actually think. And then, of course, in all religions, there's an enormous difference between the fundamentalists. You've got fundamentalist Jews, you've got fundamentalist Christians, you've got fundamentalist believers in Islam. And of course, most of the believers tend to be completely normal people who live their daily lives without any idea that they will realize paradise the next week.
Good, let's leave it at that at this point. I just wanted to touch upon one final subject that I'm afraid you are agreeing upon, which is...
If you like me to disagree, I'm quite willing to do so. It depends on the point, of course, to some.